Hi everyone, it's Stephanie, and this week I'll be presenting on Vygotsky and Lee's article that we read for this week. To start, I'll be discussing Vygotsky's Mind and Society, chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2 is titled The Development of Perception and Attention. And the key quote that I chose for this chapter is the first sentence of the chapter, which I thought encapsulated the main concepts. The linkage between tool use and speech affects several psychological functions, in particular perceptions, sensory motor operations, and attention, each of which is part of a dynamic system of behavior. So in this quote, Vygotsky is referring to a very fundamental concept in development as the mediation between tool use and speech, and also the interrelationship in the development between the functions of perception, sensory motor operations, and attention. And he'll also discuss the role of memory as we proceed through the chapters. To provide some additional historical context to what Jeff and I provided last week, Mind and Society is a collection of previously untranslated essays by Vygotsky, who, as we know, died at a very early age of 37 while he was still very much in the midst of his work. And a key concept for Vygotsky is that the development of thought and speech converge in development. And that concept and others regarding the book were discussed in a review of the book, which was published by Parker a year after Mind and Society was published. I bring this up just because I read the review and thought it was interesting, in particular due to its comparison of Vygotsky's theories with those of Piaget, two theorists who are kind of obviously giants in the child development theoretical world. And I thought it was interesting that Parker found Vygotsky's ideas to be very similar to Piaget's, and that Vygotsky mischaracterized Piaget as a maturationist rather than an interactionist. Again, I just found this personally interesting as I continue to try to understand those two theorists and how their theories are similar in ways that they are different. Also, would note that influences on Vygotsky's work include Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Blonsky, who was an older colleague of Vygotsky's. Also, in some research that I did on Vygotsky and play, I found an article by Smoluka and Smoluka in 2021 that kind of made a grand statement at the end of the article, which I quoted here as saying, Vygotsky's process of uniting thinking and speech into an internalized self-guiding voice is a process that underpins most, if not all, theories of early child development or child education. And that's a grand statement, but I believe it's fitting because Vygotsky's theories are very instrumental in the way that we think about theories of child development and teaching. As an early childhood educator myself, the ideas of scaffolding and the zone of proximal development came up consistently in my actual practice with children and really informed my work with them. Speech and perception in development is discussed in the chapter. Vygotsky brings up earlier studies on primates and the obvious difference between human and animal development. And he talks about stages of perceptual development and the role of speech. First, there's labeling. So very young children will use speech to label discrete objects. And as their language develops, speech takes on a synthesizing tool that can be used to in a more sophisticated way, describe relationships between objects and a holistic view of what's being perceived. So the chapter goes on to describe a study that shows a theory of choice behavior in children and how movement and perception is closely linked for children as opposed to adults. So this first keyboard experiment has children that are age 4 or 5 being given a keyboard and being asked to mark keys related to a series of pictures. I will preface this by saying that I would have loved a YouTube video of this experiment. It was hard for me to picture it from the description, and I think I'm still sort of struggling with the way the experiment was intended, but hopefully you'll agree with my characterization. So at first, the children were just asked to run the experiment or to perform the task with no help from marking or symbols, and their movement was characterized as sort of a simultaneous activity and perception. Their movement and their choosing of the keys was happening at the same time as their perception. It was sort of a simultaneous activity. But as they were given a symbol, a marking on the keyboard, so some symbol to mediate their movement and their perception, they had much more success. And so Vygotsky writes, the use of the auxiliary signs break up the fusion of the sensory field and the motor system. And thus there's a new behavior available and a whole new restructuring of their psychological process. Attention and memory are also instrumental in the child's ability to attend to tasks. And memory introduces a temporal characteristic of their perception. Temporal being, the time, their perception is not just on what is presently in front of them, but they can also incorporate past viewpoints into their perception. And chapter 3 builds on this discussion of memory and thinking. So we're provided with a description of the forbidden colors task. This is a task, if you recall from the reading, that asks participants to answer certain questions with certain restrictions. They can't use the same color more than once, and they can't use two forbidden colors that are predefined. And so we see that for preschool children, when they're given a set of actual color cards to help them organize their thinking, the color cards don't really help them that much. It doesn't improve their performance on the task. But for school-age children, cards actually increase their effectiveness. They use it as an externalized stimuli with success. And interestingly, when adults do this process with these color cards, the color cards don't help as much. So the auxiliary stimuli, the cards, have already been internalized, or rather their memory process has already been internalized. So the addition of the cards doesn't help as much. And so in this chapter, Vygotsky describes memory and thinking as a changing psychological functions as children grow older. So in the early stages of cognitive development, memory is their definitive characteristic of their thought. And later, they are able to think in much more abstract terms. I also found it interesting that Vygotsky describes the difference between early childhood and adolescence as a reversal of direction in memory and thinking. He says that for the young child, to think is to use memory or recall, while for the adolescent, to use memory or to recall is to use their thinking skills. So to put this in perspective of my own sort of personal research interests as an early childhood educator who's worked in play-based settings, I was very interested in seeing, what some research said about, how does this inform actual classroom practice. And so I found an article by Bodrova and Liang in 2015 that did just that. It put Vygotsky's theories of study of play into how it is interpreted in modern classrooms. And interestingly, the current field of early childhood education, they characterize it as having two interpretations of Vygotsky's play. The first is a sort of a don't interfere approach, and the second is a more of an academic approach where you promote concepts through the vehicle of play. And I think I interpreted the implications of the article, which aligns with my own view, that early childhood educators should sort of be in the middle. That they should see themselves as play mentors in helping children reach levels of mature play that promote their growth and development. And I bring this article up and this implications for play up because later in the discussion board, I have a video that shows a classroom situation with a scaffolding educator and asking you to sort of reflect on this actual classroom scene through the lens of Vygotsky's theories. So moving on to the Lee article, Carol D. Lee's article called Signifying in the Zone of Proximal Development. So this partial quote from the article is that signifying as a construct bridges what Vygotsky called spontaneous and scientific concepts. So first, what is signifying? Signifying in the African American community as a use of language is epitomized by wide-ranging skills, both spoken and written, that include, among other skills, keen listening and observation, recognition of nuanced roles, rapid-fire dialogue, and hard-driving argumentation. And the goal of the article is to show that signifying as a construct bridges Vygotskian concepts of spontaneous and scientific learning. So in Vygotsky's theory, instruction occurs both within practical contexts, home and community, these are the spontaneous concepts, and formal school settings, which are scientific concepts, the more academic learning. The ideal is if the learner builds on the spontaneous concepts that they've learned outside of school in the school context with an expert teacher who can scaffold their learning. And relationships between signifying and the zone of proximal development were shown in the article's study. So there was a quasi-experimental intervention of the article, in the article, that involved literature classes in urban high schools with Black high school seniors. And the study showed how the students' knowledge of signifying was used as a really sophisticated heuristic to examine formal literary properties such as irony or symbolism in difficult texts. So one sort of aspect of the article that I found just interesting and I pursued a little bit more was this example of the signifying monkey tail. So in the article, signifying is explained, including the dangers of failing to interpret the signifying speaker's motives. A lot was discussed about how signifying occurs between parties that are familiar with each other and are familiar with signifying. So the tail of the signifying monkey is given as an example where the monkey is speaking metaphorically while the lion mistakenly takes him literally. And the article describes how several scholars argue that these two interpretive stances reflect fundamental differences between the African American speech community and the European American English speaking community in terms of attitudes towards language. So I found a YouTube video of a performance of the signifying monkey. I don't believe you can access the link from this recording, but it will be in the discussion board. And I just thought you might find it interesting. I thought it was interesting given that the tail was referenced in the article. And in my discussion board, that will be made available. So that's it. That's the end of my presentation. I thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your comments in the discussion board.